Hey, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, good night, good whatever time it is. Welcome back to the Daily Dose of Jazz podcast. Here on Night is Alive, I've got dogs. You're going to hear them. It's the pandemic. We're all in tight spaces. I know for a fact that, Jeff, you moonlight as a zookeeper. I do believe I heard some rhinos behind you earlier, so that was weird. But, music soothes the savage beast. So that's how Jeff stays completely safe when he's working with all those dangerous animals. How are you doing today, Jeff?
I'm doing great. And you might actually hear something in the background because I have two cats who are as loud as rhinos. So you're not wrong that you might hear something, but it's not dogs, they're cats. So
that's the best part about the pandemic. We are, is it still a pandemic? I can't tell because it's kind of like half lockdown, people are like wear masks, wink type of deal right now, right. But the nice thing about it is like I've definitely got to meet more people. I've seen more bedrooms and personal spaces and animals than I ever did previously in my life. So it's just like, in some weird way, I'm sort of looking forward to other people going back to their offices because I am tired of looking at their kitchens. That is faux show.
But the pet part, that is nice.
It is adorable. It is adorable because I have a soft spot for animals, for sure. Yeah, and that's the other thing. It just gets you totally off topic, like right now. We're about to talk about the history of jazz, but then at the same time, I'm like, what kind of cats you got, Jeff? But seriously, Jeff, what kind of cats do you have?
First, they're orange tabby cats.
Okay.
And they are, like, stupid friendly. They're the nicest cats I've ever had. Doesn't matter if you've met them 100 times at the first time, they will come right up to you, like literally fall over on your feet and just be like, pick me up. Give me some loving.
I had a cat like that. I always used to call it the bear trap when they would like fall over onto their back. And you're like, I'm going to rub that belly and I'm either going to come away with 2 less fingers or it's going to be like running my fingers through the angel's back hair. It's going to be so beautiful and harps will play. So you just never knew if you were going to set off the wild trap or not. But your cats sound like they're safe.
They are great. They're great cats. Your dogs, look, I see them in the background. They're just like doing their own thing. They don't care.
They're super chill. There's no squirrels. There's a groundhog named Bill. He's not running around. So if it does start to bark, we'll pause and we'll pick up. But in the meantime, we're here to talk about the history of jazz. And this is like a really cool thing. So just to kind of circle back to Jeff and I, we work for Night is Alive. Night is Alive is this amazing company helmed by Kathy Salem. We produce, quite honestly, some of the best music in jazz. We've got no less than 2 albums. I don't think I'm allowed to say what the names of them are. I don't think so, Jeff.
Is this a drop? Or is this a...
Well, one of them's called and the other one is called So look out for those two. We have 2 albums. One of them is seasonal. It's Christmas. It's Hanukkah. And then another one is something a little more traditional. So stay tuned for those. And those will be history at one point because they're that good. They're going to be put into the history books.
That's right.
If you can't see me, I'm looking at the camera. I'm selling it to you. It's eye contact. You will buy these albums. But, jazz is really cool. All you have to do is go out there and if you name any modern band, any band from like the point from when your grandparents and maybe even grandparents were alive, every band that they listened to was most likely influenced by jazz. And at the very least, it was influenced by blues, which is, sort of that genesis seed of jazz. Jazz came out really, really soon, sort of traditional jazz as we know it, sort of came out with that. But you think even like Led Zeppelin, like every time Led Zeppelin would talk about their music, they always talked about American blues and American jazz and all of the jazz greats. And you think about pop, even Billie Eilish, it's funny to listen to her music and you can just be like, wow, those dissonant chords, the chromatic scales, all these really cool things, those all have roots with jazz. Jazz started it. Now, maybe like in a whole different alternate MCU in the Marvel timeline where, we don't kill Thanos and he snaps his finger, whatever, there's a whole different pathway. But in our universe, that's the way jazz has worked. And quite often, like a bunch of really amazing things, jazz kind of got its start through some very sort of unsavory trade, right, Jeff? I mean,
right.
It is a culture born out of African roots, and then in America, specifically the United States and in a lot of Western countries, when you have anything with Afro roots, it's going to just inevitably tied to the slave trade, and that is no different. And one, of course, it's just one of those really rare things where you've got this wonderful thing now in jazz, and it's beautiful, but its history is just so terrible, and it's
right.
And I don't know, I'm like, you talk to me for a second here about this, Jeff, because it's like, do you always have, and I have a hard time with this, like, I get conflicted when you try to separate histories from sort of its cumulative properties of what you get out of it.
Well, look, I mean, we have jazz today because of these, let's be frank, horrendous upbringings, right? So you can't ignore it, and we shouldn't ignore it. We have to, at least maybe I'm just an optimistic person, but you look at this great thing we got, jazz, the whole genre, all this great music from it, appreciate that, but acknowledge the terrible parts and the past that created what we have today. I'm big on separating art from the artist. So to me, when, as we're having this discussion, it's a lot of things have, some unsavory past to them. That's just human nature, right? So I just say, look, we can talk about, we should talk about, we can acknowledge at least how it started. But hey, that's just the start to jazz. There's a lot of really great, positive, awesome parts of jazz history later on down the line. I mean, the fact that it empowers Black and African people later on down the road, like, that's great. That's awesome. So yeah, long story short, I think we have to acknowledge and talk about kind of the bad past of jazz. But hey, with that, talk about and acknowledge the great parts from it too, because there's a whole lot of great stuff that is in and a part of jazz. So that's kind of how I see it.
That's a great way to just think about it. I agree with you. I think you do have to acknowledge history, and then celebrate the parts that are worth celebrating, and acknowledging the parts that are just there regardless.
Because we can't change it, right? I mean, we wish jazz didn't have this background, but it does. So make the best of it.
Yeah, and one of the things that, and in some ways, like looking into sort of the origins of jazz, one of the things that they talked about was something known as the Black Code. And the Black Code was specifically meant to sort of keep those who were enslaved from practicing their traditions. Like, one of the things you can do if you ever want to suppress or repress somebody is to basically strip away their identities. And one of the things you can do is get rid of traditions. And so this Black Code made things like drumming, Afro-based drumming, illegal. And one of the hypotheticals, and maybe you know more about this than I do, Jeff, one of the hypotheticals is, it's like, when they started to sort of remove those traditions, and some of those traditions were not preserved, because you got to remember, slavery lasted generations.
Too long.
Way too long.
Yeah.
You lose those traditions, and then you start to build a new musical tradition. And I did, like, one of the theories is, and maybe it's way more than a theory, you can expand on this, Jeff, that jazz sort of was born from this vacuum, from lost, unpreserved traditions. Right.
And to me, it's easy for me to say this, but this is at least how I kind of look at it. That's the beauty of it, is that through this dark period of history, a great thing was made, right? And these people took it on their own and just ran with it and made this awesome they made a genre of music. How amazing is that? Like, that is incredible that they did that. So it's unfortunate that that's how it started, but to me, it is at least worth acknowledging how cool it is that from that, they created their own genre of music. I mean, that is, to me, really, really cool, at least.
It is really cool. And like, not only is it cool, but it also, the jazz music, the roots of jazz, they started and they really evolved very quickly. Like you're talking about Creole music, you know, which is, actually even before that, even like ragtime music. We're talking like 1865. Now,
right.
This is not a whole lot of time after the Civil War. And I don't know if you watched any documentaries about the Civil War, but the music in the like all the way through the 1860s, 1800s, it's violins, it's lonely pianos, you know, it's not, hasn't evolved that greatly from chamber music at that point. And then all of a sudden, you have a whole bunch of liberated slaves. They are starting, the country part of it is celebrating a victory. And all of a sudden, ragtime shows up. And ragtime is a whole different genre of music, and it's being bolstered by this brand new freed populace. Right.
Yeah, and again, to me, that's, I mean, think about at that time, like you said, half the country is celebrating. Half of the other country not only is in despair, but very angry, right? So
very
from that,
angry, yes,
they are this all around great music is coming about, and that's at least, again, another bright spot in what is, I mean, this is still a pretty dark time in American history.
Oh yeah. But I mean, and then the interesting thing about that dark time, though, it's like you think about, you know, sort of what happened. You know, the South, well, they were punished severely. I mean, and not only that, but you know, Lincoln was assassinated. I'm drawing a blank. I'm such a bad historian. I love history, and I can't remember who took over for Lincoln after he was assassinated.
Siri.
Yeah, Siri. Hey Siri, live on the podcast. Hey Siri, who was president after Abraham Lincoln?
Okay, I found this on the web.
All right, Andrew Johnson. Okay.
Oh, I knew that.
Andrew Johnson gave it to the South. I mean, he hammered them. He basically destroyed anything war didn't destroy. Andrew Johnson went through and he made sure that it was just depleted in any way he could. But still, I mean, if you want to talk about Deep South, there is no more Deep South than Louisiana. Still a place to this day which suffers massive rifts. You know, it's hard to say segregation, but it kind of still is, especially if you talk to the residents down there. They can still see the roots. Like, the roots are still, like, there on the surface. They're not even
they wouldn't
buried.
even deny it. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. But what happens in the South during that time? You know, you have all these free slaves. They're still living in the South. It's what all they've known as home, as terrible as maybe it was. They create Creole music. Creole music, it is really sort of that first bit of up-tempo, energetic. And in fact, you go to Louisiana now, a lot of the music, a lot of the jazz is still considered Creole jazz.
Oh, see, I don't think I knew that people still use that term a lot.
Yeah, and it's like, you know, Creole's kind of a really cool, because Creole really is, well, we get into swing here, like, we get into literally the swing, not only just the swing of things, but the jazz version of swing. But Creole really sort of kicked that off. And not only does it kick it off, it stays in Louisiana. It sort of, Louisiana just becomes sort of like this beautiful egg, this nurturing spot, this nest for this music. And so we sort of sit there through the end of the 19th century. And you remember, like, we're on the Gregorian calendar, so everything that is the 19th century is 1800s. That makes a lot of sense, right? But as soon as we start getting into the end of the 1800s, we're talking like the 1890s, 1895, and then into that really early sort of 1900s, something really cool starts to happen. And that is, again, New Orleans still being that focal point. It becomes that genesis of swing. and swing really comes in. And now with swing, that again is another one of those types of jazz, which is it's indistinguishable from anything that came before it, but yet it has evolved into something that still thrives today, swing, and it happened in the course of like 30 years.
Right. And what I love thinking about this is, I mean, try and put yourself, today we are so easily accessible to every type of music, right? I mean, you can go on Apple Music, all of our albums are on there, right? Any jazz album you want is on there, and any song for any genre of music is on there. Now put yourself back at that time where, as you mentioned earlier, maybe all you've heard in your life is a piano at a bar, maybe some guy playing like the fiddle on like street corner. You go over to New Orleans and like there's this music you've never heard before, ever. I mean, how cool is that? That is just amazing to me. That experience that we've all had, discovering your favorite band for the first time, or maybe discovering just a new song from a band you already like. I mean, put yourself back at that time and you're discovering a whole new genre that sounds nothing like anything you've heard before. To me, that is just really cool thinking about that at this time, like as we're talking about jazz in its upbringing in New Orleans right now.
Absolutely. And I can't stress that enough. I mean, to be blown away. And, if you wanted entertainment, you had to leave the house, which sounds completely alien considering as much of an introvert.
Sounds terrible.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I'm already getting shivers and I'm going to talk to my therapist. But back then, it would have just been, like Jeff just said, magical. It would have blown your mind to see this happening. And when you went down there, it was literally the Afro-Americans who were doing this. And like they were the only ones doing this. And they were playing at the time, it started out them playing for themselves, and then they started playing for their audiences, which would have also have been Afro-American. But it was so good, it was so undeniable. And music is one of those great things. It shares. This is what makes music such a great art form. It's one of the things that breaks down barriers. Like,
absolutely.
Yeah. An audience, you cannot deny the beauty of, you will fall in love with a painting without ever seeing the painter. You will fall in love with music without ever seeing the musician. And this is one of those cases where, even if you do have a chance to see the musician, the music breaks down that barriers and it just brings people together. So, man, in that way, thank God for, and maybe this also has a lot to do with how fast it was evolving. Because again, this just blows my mind. You think about we're talking 60 years before there was the Civil War, and now there's swing. What a massive turn in just even thought process.
Right.
Like just that level of creativity, because we're all artists, and I don't know if you've ever noticed, but it's like, art follows trends. And if you live in a depressing time, a majority of the art is depressing. If you live during World War times, if you live during Civil War, the art is dominated by that stuff. Cold War, think about, if you're a child of the 80s, which I am, think about what art in the world was like during the 80s. Dominated by the Cold War, even if you weren't paying attention to it. So these guys come out and they really show a massive switch in a mindset. And I think that's a huge understated thing personally as an artist, how big that mindset is. So and I'm sure we'll talk about that more too.
Sure. So where are we at right now?
Right now, we're just about to get into the jazz age. We're on. Okay. Here's the precipice.
We're on the cusp.
Yeah. You can't see me, but I got my hand like this and my other hand like this. So just imagine those two things like that. Okay. Excellent. So we're right there on the edge. So maybe Jeff, maybe you lead us into this, because this is kind of a magical time for jazz.
Well, so we're talking like
1918.
Yeah, it's coming out, and again, I think we can't stress it enough, but it has to be brought up how this is really maybe I guess the correct term is Afro. Like this is started by Black Americans in the South, right? I mean, we can't. At least I can't stress that enough. That this was their music at their time. We were just listening to it, right? So it's just coming out of New Orleans and just it's spreading. And to me, that's again that harkens back to what you were talking about earlier, how music breaks down boundaries, and it really has no barriers. I mean, what a great way to empower entire populace that, I mean, just when 60 years prior they had no rights, and now here's people paying money to hear music that they've made. I mean, I just think that is the coolest thing possible. I mean, how empowering is that?
It is empowering. It is empowering. And it's one of those things too, like where, you know, my mom, and this is, you can't see me, full disclosure, I'm a white dude. My mom, when I was in school, whenever I had to do an essay on anybody famous, my mom always made me do essays on Black Afro women, because she wanted to make sure that if everything from Rosa Parks to Harriet Tubman, that's like, she would always make me do these things because she, and the funny thing is, like, when I grew up, I was completely like colorblind and naive.
Sure.
That there were even problems existing, because I was grown up to like understand just how amazing these people were in the same way. Because people, long story short, cultures, and I'm talking like racial cultures, will put more value on people who look like them. Okay, it's like a form of tribalism, and it's hard to escape. And I've read scientific papers on it, and you know, it is literally like a form of sort of evolution style tribalism. It's like, I recognize that person, he looks like me, I'm going to trust him, we're going to form alliances. And I was lucky that my mom kept me out of that. Now, years later, it's really weird because I see a lot more of the walls that I was not awakened to as a child. I see like these big partitions. And so when Black History Month comes rolling around, sometimes it just feels like it's a feel-good facade, to be honest with you.
Sure.
And the reason why I feel that is because, like, when you learn about jazz and you learn about the origins of jazz, and this is true, in some ways this is like true of just even learning about math. They don't make math interesting. They don't make history interesting, and they don't make Black history interesting. You know, and jazz is one of those things where I think could really light the imagination on like a lot of people. And oh, here's the dogs. There we go. Everybody here likes jazz. Calm down. No growling. We're almost to she's waiting for the 1920s.
That's really ironic. Your dog barked because my cat keeps getting on one of my counters, and he knows he's not supposed to be up there. So the moment I turn, he like jumps off. So I don't know if people can hear that either. But again, the wonderful having pets at home.
Yeah, see, welcome to Petland, and this is going to happen, okay? So I started to see these partitions, and I realized, well, it's like nobody's learning about the really interesting parts about this history. And one of the most amazing things that happens is this cusp of the 1918s. And the 1918s are one of the most romanticized times of America. And it really does, and I mean this in like the most sincere way, that the soundtrack to America from 1919 until well past World War II is jazz.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes something absolutely universal. Europe didn't really have a jazz scene, as it turned out, in like 1919s. They didn't really start to get one until like the 30-ish is when they started picking up American jazz. And again, Who are they picking up that American jazz from? They're picking it up from the Afro-American heritage. Although, you think one of the things that happened, Jeff, is like in 1920, we really started to see a lot of white musicians starting to become jazz musicians.
Yes. Or have music that is heavily inspired by it, right? Like the first person I think of that was huge at this time, James Cagney, right?
Yes.
Huge guy, right? Like, but his music is heavily inspired by jazz music, right? Because that was what's popular at that time. But I mean, just at that time, I mean, people still know who he is, right? But
Absolutely.
I mean, great music, but again, it's heavily inspired by the music of the time. And it's, again, important to understand where that music originated, started from. And I think that's why we're doing this episode, right? So when we talk about jazz as it is now, we can go, oh yeah, we know these people, but hey, here's the past of it. Here's why it's important. So
Yep. And you know, the funny thing is, it's like, even though it is now ubiquitous, you cannot say the Roaring '20s and not see a flapper on a piano right in your head, you know. But the funny thing is about it is, like, even then, you still see some outcry. So like jazz at this point, even though we're now talking like it's, you know, it's starting to have a full 60-year sort of tradition from its roots, or 80 years at this point. There's still some old timers, right? And here's like a really good quote here. And this quote is from Henry Van Dyke from Princeton University. And he says, "It's not music at all. It's merely an irritation of the nerves of hearing." You know, and apparently this was like kind of, if you were an older fellow, right, in the Roaring '20s, or an older lady, you know, and you didn't want little short skirts and beaded skirts and guys drinking and all those kinds of things. Because we're also talking Prohibition. You know, this jazz was not, as weird as it seems now, it was not always welcomed in your neighborhood.
but again, think about it. This is a new genre of music, right? I mean, what I have in my notes here it says from the late 1910s throughout the 1920s, the New York Times, right? Their editorial board routinely wrote articles about, quote, the dangers of jazz in society. Like, you could take that, you know, add 50, 60 years to it, and they would say the same thing about rock and roll music, right? And I'm sure, maybe not the New York Times, there's probably another publication now writing the same thing about rap music or pop music now today. So it's not surprising, but it's important, again, as we talk about the history, like, hey, this was a big deal, like, when it was starting, because of it being a new genre and where it started, right?
Yep, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, like, that's so funny though, when you make the parallels between, like, say, Dee Snider up in front of Congress.
Yes, that's exactly who I was thinking.
Yeah. He's up there just giving it to him because they're like, "Oh, you people worship Satan," you know, and he's just like, "Oh boy." You could just tell he and his hair were waiting for that moment in the Senate chambers to just give it to him. So yeah, so we were talking about, like, you know, where whites start to, I don't want to say infiltrate, that sounds so bad. I think, you know, they were just inspired, you know, nobody ever wanted to take jazz away from anybody, but you are starting to see that it's becoming so popular, people are just loving it, that obviously you're going to start to it's going to diversify, like everything in the world. As something becomes more popular, it diversifies, and, you know, that is ultimately a great thing, because you want to definitely put it into as many hands as possible. And, you know, it really just becomes synonymous with Prohibition. I'm not sure if I mentioned sort of the Roaring '20s, but, you know, the Prohibition is kind of happening at the same time. And it's that slight sort of illicit nature of jazz that we were just talking about, you know, the New York Times and this guy from Princeton saying, stay away from it, you know. They're also saying, stay away from alcohol, you know, and they're busting up all these barrels. So then what do you have happen? You have these places called speakeasy, and what's the two things that you find inside of them? You find alcohol and you find jazz. You don't find classical music. You don't find anything. You find alcohol and you find jazz. And when you think about the Roaring '20s, what do you think of? You think of alcohol and you think of jazz. Because as we all know from our parents, the more you say no, the more we say yes.
Exactly. And again, this is part of the history of the genre, right? Like, you have to acknowledge this. It's not like, it sounds so cliche, but it is the rock and roll of this time, because it's exactly what you said. When you have probably the biggest publication in the country at that time, I'm not sure, so don't quote me on that. The New York Times for over a decade is saying this genre of music is horrendous and is bringing down society. There's a generation of people that read that and go, oh, now I'm interested in it. And now they want to go listen to it.
And if you're ever wondering to yourself, well, it's like, okay, I understand that it's interesting sort of from like this, sort of this vignette standpoint, this like historical poster on the wall, but it's so far away. Well, here, I can just name a couple names that don't feel like old at all. Like you start saying words like names like Louis Armstrong. There is
timeless. Louis
Armstrong, his music plays to this day. I mean, yes. We are in the middle of September. In just a few months, you're going to start hearing, some of his music thrown into the holiday mix. Duke Ellington, for God's sakes. Timeless. Yes. I mean, it's like these are people whose names exist with names like Mozart and Beethoven. Except for Mozart and Beethoven, they seem like they're dead. In some weird way, you always think to myself, you're like, man, is Louis Armstrong still alive? Spoiler alert, he is not. But the thing is, it's like that's like really good music sort of warps time. Really good art does that too. Like it just warps time. And you feel closer to it than it really is. But that's, when you talk about the influence, that time warp, I think, is a really good indicator. If things still feel fresh or like they've happened fairly recently, that's a really good indicator of just how powerful that it was. And so, here we are.
I mean, in history terms, I mean, we're like 1920s, right? Yep. And later is what we're talking right now. That is not that long ago.
It's not.
In terms of history, like that is an absolute like drop. Like if you had an hourglass like showing time going by, that is like one piece of sand or whatever is in it going by. I mean, that's not that long. But regardless, we're talking about our grandparents' parents' generation. That music sticking around like it has, and everyone knowing, I mean, everybody knows those names you just mentioned.
Yep.
That just shows how great the music is to me. I mean, it's easy to say that, but again, think about the time that these people were becoming who we know them as they are today. They were ridiculed. They were controversial, to say the least. I mean, it is a big deal that we still know and listen to these people today.
Yes. And then, like as we progress through the 20s into the 30s, right, we're getting into a very sort of, I don't know how you people think about it, but I think about, the World War I and II sort of as like a big war. World War II is sort of the mistakes of how World War I ended type of deal.
And throw the Great Depression in there. Right?
And the Great Depression. Oh, man, to be alive, right? It's like, it would be both awesome and terrible. It's like, hey, jazz is great. I've got rickets.
And no job.
I got no job, and it's like, I'm covered in dust. So here we come. So like, now we're getting through the 20s, and the 20s are the golden age, right? That's this big, amazingly shiny golden age. And then you hit 30s, and like 30s sort of signals, a transition. But what happens is that we also do end up with sort of that big band, that big swing sound. And that big swing sound of jazz, that's really what's going to take us through like all of those things that we just talked about, and not only that, well, we'll get to the Depression in a second. I think Jeffrey's got some stuff to add to that, and if not, then that's an empty promise. But, like when we talk about swing, who are we talking about? The 1930s, we're talking about Count Basie, Cab Calloway, who I love, Cab Calloway. We're talking about Jimmy and Timmy Dorsey, Duke Ellington again, Benny Goodman. He's absolutely amazing. And then it just goes on and on and on. I've got a big list here in front of me, but I think those are like Those are literally some of the big ones. But Duke Ellington, obviously, he really sort of stands out. He's just amazing, and Benny Goodman, of course. Those two. I mean, you think about Benny Goodman's sound, like kind of on that clarinet, on the woodwind instrument, and then you have Duke Ellington, and don't even make me mention Louis Armstrong. But the 30s is built on this big swing, and and big band swing. So I mean, we're not talking like modern jazz where you're talking a quintet or a quartet or a triplet. We're talking 30 people.
Right.
An orchestra-sized jazz band. That sound was so massive.
Right. And what's interesting, I have this in my notes, is that, so it says here that the 1930s was the time that jazz really started being put, the word jazz, as we know it, started being heavily printed. And now this talks about print as terms of like volumes for like music. We're talking about like if you want a book on jazz, so you got your own trumpet, you want to try and learn how to play the trumpet, you can now go to the store and buy sheets of jazz music.
So what you're saying, this is jazz is officially attached as the genre?
Yes, that
okay.
Not just that, but like it's so big now that you have people like the New York Times ridiculing it, but now it's like, oh, you can say this word, right? Because before you were talking about Prohibition, like jazz was a dirty word and still is at this time, but like now it's in print. You can walk into a music shop and be like, I want like sheet music for jazz music, and you can buy that. So I thought that was really interesting. Like it even talks about like 1934 as being like the start to a lot of printed jazz material, which I think is really interesting.
That's
and
cool.
Just like it just like explodes from there on. But like think about that. It's that genre of music we talked about starting really after the Civil War. It takes till the 1930s for really like it to be printed in a way that is mainstream.
That's crazy. What a weird thing to even think about. Like, you never really.
I mean, we're spoiled by the internet, right? But at that time, if it wasn't socially acceptable to walk into, say, a music store and ask for jazz music, like sheet music, you might have been like told to get out, right? But now it's like, no, you can go and buy it.
I wonder how long it takes for like a place just like Gary, Indiana, like to suddenly start getting jazz music, and then how long it takes for that to disseminate through a community. I mean, it just seems, I mean, I guess that's what touring is for. Touring is about, getting in front of people and sort of, word of mouth. And there's always outliners who know more about something than you do. And then hopefully if they're your friends, they'll sort of key you in on the prospects. But yeah, you just think about like, Nebraska, somewhere in the middle of Nebraska. When did jazz finally reach there? Was that in 1934, or did it take them?
No, that's exactly. Well, look, that's not the official date, right? Like,
but I mean, you know what I'm saying, right?
It's like it says that like before really the 30s, it was really only vocally shared. Like people would get together and be like, all right, like let's try and make some music, and they put together, and that's the band. And now it's really not till the 30s that, again, you can go and buy a book on jazz or, a sheet, like a whole bunch of music sheets, and try and learn it yourself. I mean, the fact that it's taken that long, to me, now granted, it's, you have technical limitations of the time, but still it's taken to, for some reason, it points out 1934. It doesn't say what happens exactly, but to it take that long, I mean, to me, that's pretty crazy.
I mean, it is. I mean, that is kind of crazy. Especially, I mean, like, again, we're gonna get into this one of these like super iconic people who becomes sort of like definitely a mascot, because we're heading into sort of pre-war and also during war now. Like if you go from the 30s to the 40s, we're definitely in wartime. Mm-hmm. And then you start talking about people like Frank Sinatra. And Frank Sinatra, he's a front man, but he was a front man for sort of that for jazz as a swagger, as an attitude, because that's one of the things that, you know, this just luckily sort of like puzzle pieces straight into what Jeffrey was talking about. The attitude starts forming for jazz, right? Like you really start to get that New York, New Jersey attitude. And you've got, you know, I've seen examples and I've heard radio broadcasts during the World War II eras where Frank Sinatra, you know, he's singing vocals over jazz to people who are across an entire ocean in a whole nother country, fighting a very dire war with, I mean, and if you love history, there's no end of documentaries about World War II. But I mean, what a dark time that was. We're also now in the Great Depression.
Right.
I mean, you know, it's like there's this whole vibrant side of art. There's this whole beautiful, vibrant side, this creative side with jazz. But meanwhile, on the other side of the curtain, where the audience can't see, or where the audience is actually sitting, it's this really sort of dark, tumultuous world. It's like, you know,
right.
All the newsreels are black and white, but I can only envision that time in black and white in my head.
But I think that shows, if you go back and listen to, I mean, jazz music is just upbeat in general, right? But to me, it's always been interesting when you listen to jazz, big band music, I mean, war music. It actually is always, not always, it usually is really upbeat and like fun. And I think it's because that was a lot of people's escape, right? From these horrendous things that are going on, not just going on, lasting for years. I mean, the Great Depression was a whole decade, for crying out loud. World War II, I mean, 4, 5, 6 years, depending on, you know, what events you want to start at. I mean, this music was a great way for people to escape from that. Doesn't matter who the artist is, that's just how it was.
Like you would go to New York during the Great Depression and you could see Cole Porter musicals on Broadway.
Yeah.
You know, even during those, like, I mean, the thing is called the Great Depression. There's really not a more depressing term than to use the word depression. So in order for, you know, and you've got George Gershwin, it's very strange to think how positive it is. And then again, as another sort of black and white comparison, you go back to the Civil War, a whole different wartime. They had songs that the army would ban people from listening to because the songs were so depressing that the soldiers were killing themselves. They were so depressed by the music that they were listening to.
Right.
So, I mean, it's pretty bad when you have to outlaw a song. Now, meanwhile, in another very dark time in history, art spurred on by something that was born shortly after the Civil War is now actually boosting an entire culture. It just blows my mind. It's just so crazy. It's just like, what?
That is a great point. I'm so glad you said that. That's such a great point. I wasn't even thinking that. That's such a good point.
It's just so cool. And then, so now we're working through this absolutely tumultuous time. You know, the Great Depression, the only thing that really helped the Great Depression out was World War II. It turned us into a military state. It put everybody to work. It turned America into the industrial nation that it is today. So, you know, again, another one of those times in history where it's like all you have to do is just look at the Holocaust and you're like, would America's prosperity ever be worth the lives lost to the extent where we felt like we had to go and, you know, get involved? And it's like, I would never want to be the person, the actuary or mathematician who would ever have to sort of like weigh the pros and cons, because I don't think you ever could. But another dark part of history that has some sort of positive outcome, jazz lives through it and actually helps contribute to that positive income. And then, we get to the 40s, and now the 40s become our wheelhouse. If you listen to Night is Alive jazz, you are listening to jazz as it is in the 40s, because something is invented, and I don't know if did you find this term bebop when you were searching your stuff, Jeffrey?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I did not realize that was a jazz term. I don't know if I'm just an uncultured swine, but I've heard that for so long that I don't know. I thought that was like nothing related to jazz, and I saw that, I'm like, oh, that's where that term started.
Exactly. And
So
I wonder if it gets usurped, because like when I think about bebop, I think more doo-wop than anything else. And you know, doo-wop is sort of like you know, it's a form of rock, whereas bebop, turns out, not only is it a form of jazz, but it is literally the anchor. Bloop, just drop the anchor in the water. That is where traditional jazz as we know it really becomes, and there's a massive switch. So before bebop, jazz is about grabbing your lady's hand and you're twisting around and you're dancing and it's a danceable type of music. Bebop comes and the musicians start to evolve to the point where now they don't care if you dance, they care about the challenge, right? So now they're actually playing music to challenge themselves, and it becomes very undanceable, but it takes on a life as its own art form. So if you think about it, oil painting versus cave drawing, and I understand there's a big gradient in between those two things, but it is in some ways sort of that leap, because danceable music and rhythmic music, you know, you're making it for the people who are listening to sort of move to it, and you have to have a certain level of accessibility. Now, jazz really has nothing to do with the accessibility. It's still beautiful and people love it, but now it's intricate. There's solos. It gets crazy. It gets really fast. You know, there's this old joke that jazz is 5 musicians all soloing at the same time.
It sounds great. But that's bebop, right? That's like where you start to get like those people who, like, you know, the bass player is doing something that seems to have nothing in common with what the piano guy is doing, but it works. And the drummer, oh my God, does he need help? Get that man a stretcher and a cold towel. But everything is working together. And like when you were looking this kind of stuff up, Jeffrey, I mean, what were they saying about bebop? Because everything I was looking at was talking about just the technicality, how they just really were starting to make the music for themselves. Right. Okay, I have a great quote about bebop. It's from American jazz drummer, bandleader Kenny Clark. Okay. Mm-hmm. He said, quote, "Bebop was a label that certain journalists later gave it, but we never labeled the music. It was just modern music, we would call it. We wouldn't call it anything really, just music." And to me, like, I think that's really cool. That's end quote, by the way. So, but like, I mean, I think it's cool that we give like terms like that, but you gotta, again, remember at the time, this is just what music was to people. I mean, that is the modern music of that time. They didn't call it bebop. They didn't really call it anything. It was just like, this is jazz. This is the music right now. We give it terms like bebop to help distinguish it from other things. But you gotta remember, again, at this time, like, this is the big music of the time. That's what it's considered. It's just music.
But it's interesting because, you know, like, I think now we refer to it, and most of the people that we deal with, you know, you would either call it standards, right? Jazz standards. A lot of jazz standards were born in this era. If you go to look at our albums, a lot of those jazz standards are on our albums. And it's also called like traditional, which is kind of funny because we've just spent like 40 minutes talking about the tradition of jazz, and we're just now getting to do the traditional part of things, you know, so that's really kind of funny to think about. But, you know, you had that great quote. What I had down here were some of the characteristics that really sort of set this new version of jazz apart from each other. It was really sort of differentiated by the the way that it was arranged. But it seems so common because then they have a semicolon and then they go through all the different ways of how it changed. It's like, oh, it was faster, more intense, considered explosive. They had different types of chords. They had what they called alternating chords, chromatic and dissonant variations of the chords. And then you get this thing called improvisation. So you go back 10 years to that swing, and if you've ever seen like the old footage, they're all sitting there on the bandstands, and in front of them they all have their music and they're all following it, and there's even a conductor and he's probably like conducting the jazz, and everybody's on and they all change their pages at the same time, on and on and on. Now you're in improvisation territory, so you may have sheet music to sort of help remind you of where it's going, but that's just it. It's like when you to give you an analogy, sometimes you open up your GPS and you don't need to know every single house that you're passing. You just need to know the road, and you just sort of follow the road. That's what improvisation is, sort of like in music. You just sort of know where it starts and where it ends, and then you take it all over the place. I'm sure this existed in some way, but it never existed like it did up until this point. And the 40s really becomes that place where you start to see what we would consider these breakout artists, these absolutely insanely talented sort of breakout artists. Okay, here's a great one. Dizzy Gillespie. You start seeing Dizzy Gillespie out there. It's like, okay, he's about as good as it gets.
That's right.
So I thought that was like really, really, really cool. And then not just Dizzy Gillespie. He's a really good, but you start seeing Charlie Parker. And Charlie Parker, if you don't know who Charlie Parker is, you've got to go look Charlie Parker up. He is one of the most amazing jazz musicians of our time. In fact, whenever we do any of our albums, we still sort of talk about Charlie Parker. He was an amazing saxophone. And in some ways, like he's not the first jazz saxophonist, but he's sort of the progenitor of like, if you're going to be a jazz saxophonist, chances are you're going to be just like, trumpeters are like Dizzy Gillespie, or another one of my favorites, Thelonious Monk.
I was hoping you weren't going to forget him. I was going to call you out if you did.
All right, good. No, I can't, because again, whenever we have our meetings, it's always like Thelonious Monk, Charlie Parker and Thelonious Monk are like out there all the time. I don't know if you have anything in specific to add to Thelonious, but before we do that,
yes,
I am a drummer, so I have to talk about Max Roach.
Okay.
And Max Roach is there's a couple of my favorite drummers of all time. Him, Buddy Rich is a really great one, but Max Roach, again, he sort of becomes that high watermark that everybody sort of wants to be. He's kind of got it all. He sort of reinvents how to play the drums. Just to keep things short here, Jeff and I will in the future podcast start to highlight some individual artists, both modern and those that have passed, and Max Roach will be one of those. So I'll leave it there. But yes. Anyway, I don't know if you have anything about Thelonious you'd like to throw in there, but go for it.
Not about him, but this is a shameless plug, but Bill Cunliffe, who is on several of our albums, he has won awards featuring Thelonious Monk. So like his influence cannot be understated, because musicians today are still not only playing his music, obviously, but to get an award like that is a big deal in our industry because of who he was, right? So none of these people can be understated, but I'm glad you brought him up, because Bill Cunliffe worked and always is working really hard, and he's won, I know at least once, maybe several awards for that pertain to Thelonious Monk. So I just want to, maybe that's a shameless plug.
I mean,
we wanted to call it out.
Grammys here, people. I mean, it's just like
true.
it's like, you know, whenever you talk about the award for music, Grammy, Bill Cunliffe, and I think even one of his songs is named like Thelonious or something like that. I mean, it's just
That sounds right.
yeah. He just has. When you talk about Thelonious, you are definitely. Well, it just goes without saying he's at the top. He's at the top of that list, and you know, there are a handful of people, the guys that we just sort of called out, and a couple more. They really sort of defined that era. And again, that era is the era that survives now. You know, when you talk about sort of like, it's very weird, like the history between now and the 1940s, because it sort of goes like this. There's like I'm drawing like a parabolic line here, like a sine wave, because it sort of drifts away from traditional and comes back and drifts away and comes back. But we're always, from here on out to modern times, we're always sort of meeting in the middle by the music that is in fact being defined at this point that we're talking about, the 1940s. Okay, there was all types of commas in that sentence. That would be terrible to write in a term paper. I would have gotten it straight. Everything. My editor would have had red lines everywhere, all over the place. So here's kind of an interesting thing: Latin jazz. It's taken all this time. Latin jazz starts to enter the fray. And we're talking about like the 60s here. So we're taking a little bit of a jump, but the 40s sort of rides us through the 50s. The 50s, we start seeing Dave Brubeck. You know, we're starting to see some of the smoother jazz types of things, sort of the post-war jazz types of things. But, you know, for me, I always felt like jazz always had a really strong Latin, influence, or that Latinx.
Wow.
Heavily influenced jazz, but you know, we're really kind of getting to this point where Latin really starts to pick up jazz. We're talking like 1960s, which I think is
I've never, again, maybe I'm a uncultured swine, but I obviously I know of Latin jazz, listen to it, but it's always been kind of like a newer part of jazz to me, if that makes sense. It's never been like we just went through the history up to this point. To me, that's what I always think of. Latin jazz is usually like the new hip thing to me when I think about jazz music.
Well, to circle it around, when we first talked about that Black Code where they outlawed, you know, traditional music, and that Black Code basically starved those traditions from the slaves living in America, there were other places in Cuba, in the Bahamas, where those rules weren't the same. And so their traditions preserved, right? So they didn't evolve musically the same way that we did. So now you start getting Latin jazz, which is, you know, that American jazz, but now you are literally bringing in actual ethnic sort of rhythms into it. And that's kind of that genesis of Latin jazz, like where you start getting the actual, obviously it has evolved as well, but it's bringing a lot more of the traditional rhythms with it. And the same thing is also happening, you know, like when I say like Latin jazz, we're talking, they call it Afro-Cuban, right? Because it still has the African roots. It's Afro-Brazilian because it still has the African roots. You know, so it's got all those real Afro roots, but now it is, you know, it's now got sort of the Latin roots and the American jazz. So I just thought that was really cool because in my head, you know, they were sort of indistinguishable. So it's always kind of cool to see that birthplace of a genre.
Right. Yeah, you know, that's a great point. Obviously you did much more homework than I did. You get an A+. Yes,
I get like a banana sticker, man.
That makes sense, but it's, again, so important looking back at the history of how jazz started coming out of such oppression for a people. And for that oppression to really continue in new ways, right? Yep. You got the New York Times calling it terrible things, or just basically the music or terminology being outlawed in a way. For that music to expand and flourish in other regions of the world. I mean, that's awesome. That's really cool. And so important to understanding the history of jazz.
Very important, very important. That's why, like this is already, we're getting close to the end here, people. I know everybody's probably like, oh my God, how many more years are there? Are they going to talk about the future? Look, we're really getting close here because now we're sort of in the modern era. You start getting into jazz fusion. Do you know a whole lot about Frank Zappa by any chance?
I don't know that name. No.
So Frank Zappa is, he's an amazing guy to definitely look at, to look up and to listen to his music. But he really, and Jimi Hendrix too. Jimi Hendrix, a lot more people might be familiar with Jimi Hendrix, but Frank Zappa, they created this thing called like jazz fusion. And jazz fusion is just what it sounds like. You take jazz, but you take that traditional style of jazz that we talked about, like where it's kind of, I'm going to use the term technical because that's what I'm used to saying, in music where there's a lot of expertise involved, and they just create these amazing sort of soundscapes, but it's also infused with rock. So that's kind of happening during the 60s and the 70s. Of course, the 60s and 70s are another point in time where people are fighting, different types of oppression. Now, they're actually doing again the civil rights very heavily in the 60s. You're starting to see white musicians fight really hard for the rights of all the people around them, including, the Afro-American people who, let's face it, it's like, oh, slavery's over, but Jim Crow is still around, segregation is still around. 1960s weren't that far away, and it was pretty rough back then. So, jazz is still, it's playing a less of a part. Rock has really started to take over a lot more, but jazz fusion is still there, and it's still definitely a weapon, to basically get your voice heard and to fight oppression. But the big thing I wanted to talk about here, before we get into true sort of more modern jazz, sort of like our last bit of jazz history, and then we'll check in with Jeffrey to see if I'm missing anything. Miles Davis shows up, and he says, you want to know something? It's cool if we play jazz with electric bass guitars. And it's cool if we play jazz with electric pianos. And it's cool if we play jazz with electric guitars and, like bass, electric, and he electrifies the jazz band is what I'm trying to say. Which is like, it's kind of mind-blowing because like electric guitar has been around for a while now. Chuck Berry has been playing electric guitar for a couple decades at this point. And here we are in 1970 where Miles Davis fully embraces the electric instrument approach in his In a Silent Way album, which is considered the first true fusion album. So I just thought that was kind of cool. Up to that, it was all acoustic.
But to me, this speaks to what makes the genre of jazz so great, is that you can just add in instruments like this, and it works. It feels like it's been that way forever. Obviously, it hasn't, but it works and flows, and it just sounds and feels natural. Now, I'm sure there's some purists out there that would say that's not real jazz, but overall, it's like, man, that's what I love about this genre so much, is that you can go through history like this and find when the music was changing, how it changed, but it's still jazz at the end of the day, and it all sounds great to me.
It does sound great, and this will probably lead you into something. You should know the connection.
Don't put that pressure on me.
Oh, well, maybe not though. What about, okay, what if I say Weather Report and Janice Siegel?
Oh, yes. Okay. I know where you're going with this. Maybe.
Not that much pressure. Not that much pressure. So Weather Report comes out 1971. It is considered a turning point for jazz. I mean, it's considered a massive turning point for jazz. It takes everything that was great about jazz up to now and sort of turns it into a production that becomes mainstream. And
Right.
Downbeat magazine, which we Jeff and I are very familiar with, they basically give it album of the year. You know, they considered it, literally they described it as, quotes, music beyond category. End quote. That's just how sort of insane it is. And it's because it's jazz, but it's also, it's got just a complete, as they call it, a rejection of standard methodology. You know, it's
Right.
like they just take it in a whole new place. And the reason why we know Janice Siegel, Mr. Swan, is...
Can I say? I know she's working with us, right? I can say that.
Yeah, no, you can totally
Yeah,
say it.
she's in our newest album.
That's right.
At this time, at this recording, our newest album. We have more coming out, but yeah,
That's
she's
right.
great vocals.
She is lead vocals on our album, Crying in My Whiskey, available now. I know that's such a shameless plug, but you've got to listen to it. I mean, but the only reason why, I mean, like, and believe me, I'm not pointing this out because she's in it. This album, Weather Report, is always, it always has its own citations and footnotes and pull quotes because the 1970s really sort of like, you know, we're still talking about Miles Davis and like his embracement of that electric fusion. And this, you know, what often happens is somebody embraces something and experiments, and then the next person sort of perfects it, right? Like the car,
Right.
like Henry Ford didn't invent the car. He invented the methods that made the car popular, right? So it's like,
Oh, we are gonna get a lot of comments on that.
come and get us. You think I care? I got it. I'm like, my exoskeleton is made out of titanium, and my tears are acid. All right, so even if you make me cry, you'll still get burned. There you go. I just came up with that. All right, so anyway.
Perfect. All right.
Okay, so the weather report, and then before I got into the weather report, you know, Jeffrey was talking about sort of that how great it is that people embrace it, and how people are going, oh, you know, like you get these people who go, oh, you know, this is going too far. You know, I want the traditional thing again. I don't like, you know, where things are headed. And weirdly enough, we get to the 1980s. 1980s really sort of brings us to where we are now. And it is called traditionalism. And this is, if the 40s is where we're born with traditional jazz, the 80s is what brought it back and said, no, this is the definition of jazz.
Right.
Jazz is this traditionalism. So that's why jazz nowadays, to this day, on our albums, the stuff that you love, that you listen to, has, you know, sort of that indistinguishable sound, that technique. It's because in the 80s, they came back to that traditionalism that was, who was it founded on? Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. And now we're back, right?
Right. And it, you know, everyone still puts their spin on it. You have to.
Yep.
But a lot of it just pays respect to this time of, it's funny, like the 80s is such an interesting time for music. I mean, that's its whole other that's a whole other topic, right? I mean, there's some parts of it where the 80s just in general are very conservative and traditional, and other times, especially music, it's the whole complete opposite. It's like, this is all new, great stuff, right?
It's
But
the birthplace of synth.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, it's just funny, like hearing traditional, like that word used for jazz, and then you go, oh no, the 80s, right?
Yeah, right. Oh, I mean, like, go watch an 80s movie and just listen to the soundtrack. You'll probably be like, oh my God. And then meanwhile, you know, who do you get? You get Chick Corea, who just passed away not that long ago. And then, you know, Please Don't Ever Leave Us. You Must Live Forever. Herbie Hancock, who embraced the best of both worlds, but even though he had his own albums that were totally out there and crazy, he basically brought back the acoustics versions of jazz. So like, I can't remember the name of the song, but like Herbie Hancock, he would do soundtracks and he had all these really cool songs that were very synth heavy, and they're awesome. They're some of the best. Like, if you want synth music from the 80s, Herbie Hancock delivers. But even though he did good in that genre, or in that style, I should say, he still came back to the acoustic traditional and made it work. Brought it back to life. Said, no. Come back. Let's bring this back. And I think a lot of it has to do with, jazz is, this is sometimes used in a bad way, but I think it's kind of true. There's a level of gatekeeping in jazz where, but it's part of the mythos. It's part of the right to be a musician, a jazz musician, is to gatekeep the tradition and to be really good at your craft. You might love Eddie Van Halen, but Eddie Van Halen, even at his most technical, is still looked up to the traditional jazz artists because they're on a whole nother level. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with Jeffrey, Willie Jones III.
Yes, great drummer. Unbelievable.
Out of control good. Donald Vega on piano, absolutely insane. Bill Cunliffe, we talked about him. Terrell Stafford. I mean, so it is definitely on a whole nother level. John DiMartino, and then of course we just talked about Janice Siegel. I mean, the things that she does with her voice are just absolutely.
But they're masters of their craft, right? Like you said, they're not. It's not to put them down. It's like they're great at this traditional jazz. That's what they do. But they are just absolute masters at it.
Mm-hmm. They are absolute masters. And now you're starting to get people, like if I use the term Kendrick Lamar, people are like, oh, that's like hip hop. But, Kendrick Lamar, he worked really heavily with contemporary jazz artists to craft. He had an album called, I think it was, I should look it up. No, I can remember it. To Pimp a Butterfly. I think that's the name of his album. I know that's not a very jazz album.
That is new to me. I don't know this.
But he had like jazz artists come in because it's like, and I love Nine Inch Nails. Trent Reznor, he uses all types of, heavily influenced jazz musicians. By the time he's done with it, you would never know. But but that's his style because everybody knows it's like, garbage in, garbage out. Mm-hmm. Well, the opposite is true as well. If you have great in, you have a much higher quality of having great out. And so just to sort of wrap things up here, kind of in the modern era, we are talking about the musicians who are on our label. Again, it is Willie. Ralph Moore is on there. Who else am I missing?
We got Willie, Ralph, Terrell, you mentioned, Bill Cunliffe, Donald Vega. I got it's like a laundry list. I mean, these are, again, it's a shameless plug, but it's true. These guys are some of the best in their field right now. And to me, it's very fortunate that we get to work with people of this caliber. But I mean, you mentioned it earlier. I mean, Bill's got Grammys for crying out loud.
I know, he's doing something right.
They've all won awards for their craft, and it's just awesome. They're like, please, this is not just a plug for us. Like, listen to their music if you want to understand the history of jazz that we've talked about this whole episode.
Yes.
They're like great examples of that. And I would say that regardless of like who I worked for or where I was at, because that music is jazz at its best.
Yep. And use tools, go on to Spotify and just start in a random place, type in Duke Ellington and then see where you are, like 10 related radio plays later. Because you probably will be knee deep in Colors of Jazz, which is one of our albums.
Yes.
And there's even a song in there, I think it's called Billy and Duke and Me or something to that effect. Or get out there and just look up one of the jazz standards on out there, like oh goodness, what's a really good one? Well, Cry Me a River is really good.
Oh, yes.
give me 1 second here while I look up this one song that I've been listening to nonstop. I will find it. Oh, here's that rainy day, and then it's called Duke and Billy. That's that one that I was just talking about, and then the other one I really want you to listen to is on our Lovers and Love Songs album, and it's been a long day.
The first time ever I saw your face.
It's great, but the one I'm thinking of is From This Moment On. Holy cow. That song is, I mean, when we open and close our podcast, I open and I close it on that song. So go to Spotify, go search up From This Moment On. If you want to find the Lovers and Love Songs version, because it's my own personal favorite, it's the one that we did, so it makes sense. Pluggity plug. Hey, look, you're listening to the Night is Alive podcast. I mean, what do you think we're gonna do? Sell somebody else's stuff? No. No.
Well, hey, that's kind of what we do, right? I mean, like, we're not making this music. These guys make the music.
It's true. It's true. And Thelonious Monk, he was around way before Jeffrey and I, so he's good just because he's good. We talked about him a lot, so there you go.
True.
I mean, Jeff, I think we've ran through everybody, through a really extensive history lesson here. Is there anything that I'm missing?
Oh, well, okay. Look, I'm sure we missed something.
Okay, we've missed a lot.
Yeah.
Look, do not comment. That's not what I meant. Okay?
Yeah. This is a run through of jazz history. This is not before we started recording, you were talking about Ken Burns. This is not a Ken Burns level anything.
Yeah, I mean, watch Ken Burns if you're that interested, right?
Right. But no, I think we hit the major stuff, and really, if you're walking away with anything, just remember where jazz started, how it started. Next time you're listening to not just one of our albums, but any jazz album, understand that history, remember where it came from, because that is how the music started, right? It just remember that. I want people to remember that. It's really important.
It is important. I don't think there's any other way to actually end a podcast better than that. So on that note of remembrance and reverence and honor, we will check you all later. This was episode 2. Episode 3 will be coming soon. It'll be myself, Benjamin Lehman, and this guy over here,
Jeff Swan.
Yes!
There's my cats in the background. I don't know if you hear them right now, but they sound like rhinos right now. They're running around crazy.
He lives in a zoo. They're not cats. They're rhinos. Don't let him fool you. He's doing this because I'm sure that there's some sort of government agency trying to find him. But yeah, they're cats, whatever. All right, guys, have an absolutely amazing evening, and we will see you on episode 3. Peace out.